Okay, so now in chapter 6, for that macroeconomic perspective, we're just gonna kind of review through the chapter, talk about a few things, and hopefully it's gonna be helpful to you guys. So when we are thinking about how do we know if our economy is healthy or not? And I'm right there on page 137, 138. How do we know if our economy is healthy? What would be some of the things that we could look at to see if our economy is healthy? The things we've been talking about in 6, 7, 8, and 9.
There's not high prices, like high interest.
Okay, so the interest rates do affect our economy, right?
Yeah,
Okay,
it's somewhat affordable, I should say.
yeah, goods have to be affordable based upon the incomes we have, right? And in the recent past, due to inflation, the cost of the prices overall in our economy has increased at a much higher rate than our incomes have increased. Because the prices of products for the 2 years after COVID, they increased at about 9.5% per year. But our incomes, they didn't increase by 10% a year, or maybe even at all. And a lot of people got laid off. Okay, so if you look there on page 138, you can see macroeconomics focuses on the economy as a whole, or the whole economies as they interact. So we may have large economies. If you look over here on the board, if we're looking at the health of our economy, if you can look over here, guys. Right over here, remember I drew that little cliff? Because right now in our economy, we are at an uncertain point, and things aren't really reacting the way the Federal Reserve thought that they would react when they increased the interest rates. They increased the interest rates to slow down spending because inflation was going so high. So it worked to some extent because raising the interest rates slowed down the economy or the purchasing somewhat, but not to bring the inflation rate down to the goal. What's the goal for the inflation rate? 2%, right? So right now we're about 3.5%. And they were planning to, and I think I mentioned this in class last time, but they were hoping that by raising those interest rates, we'd get down to 2%. It only has got down to 3%. They were going to cut the interest rates and bring them down to stimulate spending again, and so people could borrow money again more. But they were going to do that in January, but the rate of inflation hadn't come down enough, and they were planning to do that again this summer. And now the latest thing I've heard is they're not planning to reduce those interest rates because we're still at 3.5% inflation, which is higher than the goal. Is 0 a realistic goal for the percent of inflation? No. We're always going to have some increase in prices, it's just the rate at the increase. So right here on the edge of the cliff, here we are. We don't know if we're going to have what they call a soft landing, where we've had some impacts to our economy, some slowing of the economy, or whether we're actually going to have a hard landing and end up in a recession. It depends on which economists you hear talking or whatever. There's different people with different ideas. Now hopefully we'll have that soft landing and we'll come right back up here to the same level we were at. If we go into a recession, it's going to be a tough time, because that's when we're going to start spiraling and firms won't be able to sell enough product, they'll have to lay workers off, and then workers can't spend money, and it's just a big, it could be a spiral, and we sure don't want to go into a depression, which they aren't thinking right now. But is economics an exact science? Can they always tell what's going to happen? No, there's a lot of uncertainty. Okay, so if we look here, we can look at some goals for our economy. We've got our economic growth, we want low unemployment and low inflation. Does that make sense after we've covered that information? Yeah, because if we start going into that recession, what's going to happen to our unemployment or our employment levels?
People will lose their job.
Yeah, people will lose their jobs, we're gonna have higher unemployment. So that's why our goals here, we want economic growth that we measure by what? 3 letters up on the board. How do we measure the economy and what it's producing? GDP, and that stands for, yep, gross domestic product, yes. So we look at that and we see how we're doing with our GDP. Are we increasing? And by how much? And that low unemployment we want, which means our economy is doing pretty well. There's jobs available for those that want them. And then the low inflation. Because as those prices increase, it just eats up the buying power of our dollar. And then the framework, we're going to be looking at aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Remember when we talked about that aggregate rock? Okay, that's a whole bunch of different pieces all put together. That's what our aggregate supply and our aggregate demand are. All the little industries and all the little areas put together into an aggregate demand and supply. That will be chapter 11. We're gonna skip 10. We may talk about it a little bit, but we're gonna jump right into 11. And the Keynesian and the neoclassical models, that's like 12 and 13, I think. And we'll talk about those, but not in detail. That would be for a more advanced economics class. And then the policy tools. To finish out our class, we'll talk about monetary policy and fiscal policy, okay? Monetary policy deals with banking, the banking industry in that, and the money supply. Fiscal policy deals with government decisions and policy making that they do, like through the legislature or things like that, okay? So that's kind of that overview. Does it make more sense now than when we first started chapter 6? Yeah, because you've learned, you've got a better base of reference. So that kind of takes care of page 139 there, except for talking more specifically about GDP, that gross domestic product. What all goes into our GDP? We look at, and it's right up on the board there, I know you might not be able to see it. We look at those 4 basic elements, right? And there is the acronym that can help you, that CIGTB, trade balance, right? So C stands for what? Consumption, and that would be businesses, consumers, individuals, industries. Who's consuming the goods that are produced, right? And that is 67.2%. That's 2/3 of our GDP on average, okay? And then we have the I, investments, and that's business investments, not like individuals like investing in IRAs. This is business investment into expansions, into more equipment, whatever it might be. And that is less than 1/5, at about 17.4%. So does it have an impact?
Yes.
Yeah, but it's not the biggest part of GDP. And then we've got our government, 18.5%. Again, that's less than 1/5. These are about the same. So government consumption, basically, the government purchasing. And then we have our trade balance, okay? That's a balance between what and what?
Imports and exports.
Yep, imports and exports, yep. And so we need to look at whether we're having more exports, where we're selling out of our country, exporting, or whether we're bringing more in, importing. And so which is better, to have higher exports or higher imports?
Exports.
Yeah, we want to have higher exports because that means we're selling more than what we're buying. But what is it in reality for us?
Imports are the highest.
Yeah, the imports are higher than the exports, so we actually have a trade deficit right now, which is not in our favor. Probably about 20, 30 years ago, we had a trade surplus, so we had more exports than imports. But that has switched around, okay? And there are a lot of people who want to try to protect, basically, our export, our trade balance, and, like buy made in America or whatever. I went through my closet and I looked at different clothing, and how much of the clothing that we wear, that we purchase in this country, is made in America?
Not a lot.
Very, very little. Like, where would be some of the countries where our clothing is made?
China.
Okay, China,
Mexico.
Mexico, India, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, I mean, lots, what were you gonna say?
Huh?
You said something,
I was gonna say Italy.
where? Oh, Italy, yeah, sure. So other countries, and a lot of times, it's those countries that have a lower economic, base because the labor is cheaper. And so our companies here in the United States can buy the clothing for a lot less and make a higher profit margin. Okay, so GDP, very important. SIGT, I think. TB, okay? All right, so, we look at that, we look at all those components, you can see in the, chart, there on page 140, you can see the chart that shows the breakdown of the percentages, you can see that pie chart, and that pie chart, a lot of times graphically, you can see more of a comparison more easily, that consumption expenditure is 2/3 and the rest is made up of that. So is the trade balance a very big part of GDP? Percentage-wise?
No.
No, it's fairly small, but it's still an important part for our country. Okay, and then we can look here at those charts at the top of page 141. And we can see, again, graphically, how large consumption is compared to government and investment. And the trade balance is very small, that it's not even indicated there. And imports and exports themselves, you can see how they were much closer back in 1965. That was a good year. That'd be about 40 years ago. You caught what I said, it's a good year? That's when I was born. No, that would be about 60 years ago, excuse me. Yeah. So we actually had a trade surplus, but you can see how that changed over time, and by, about 1980 to 85, it switched from being a trade surplus to a trade deficit. We had to start importing more than what we were exporting, so there's a big shift there. Okay. So how do they measure GDP? It's that big process, right? And how do they collect all of the information? Page 142. How do they collect the information to be able to tell how much consumption, how much business investment, how much government spending there was? They send out questionnaires, right? Surveys, because they've got to collect the data some way, right? So they have all of these censuses. So I wrote them out, I just labeled them as I went down through here, so you guys can do the same if you want. There's a census of businesses every 5 years. So every 5 years, every business will get this questionnaire and they need to answer it concerning what they're producing, how much their income is from that, and survey of retail sales is monthly. So they look how the sales are going every month. Then foreign trade data, that's imports and exports. Can you guys see it okay there? Yeah. Okay, and then census comprehensive survey of households and residential finances. That's the census we hear about most. That is like every person in the United States is supposed to complete this census. Does every person in the United States complete the census? No, they can't get everyone to answer. Have I answered probably 4 times myself in the last 40 years since I graduated from high school? Yes. Because they want to know how much well, first of all, they want demographics. How many people are in your family? Where are you living? What's your income of all the family members? Lots of different questions. They ask all of the demographics with gender, race, different things like that, okay? And then there is an investment census, one for construction that's done monthly, and expenditures like physical capital and equipment. What are businesses spending? And then federal government purchases, census of governments, the state and local governments, they do that once a year annually. And then we look at foreign trade, imports and exports monthly, energy, healthcare, rental income, and farming. So looking at all of those different production parts of the economy, okay? So that would be there on page 142, and I'm getting caught here on my finger. Excuse me, there we go. Okay, and then we talked about trade balance, trade surplus. There on page 143 is the, basically the formula for GDP, okay? And there's another way we can look by what is produced. And so we can look at a breakdown of the different types of goods, the durable goods, non-durable goods, services, structures, and change in inventories. And we can look at the percentages. On that chart on page 143, what would be the highest part of the production in our economy? Services, because that's 60.8%. And is the service side of our economy growing all the time?
Yes.
Yeah, more and more as a society and as an economy, and especially in the more developed countries, we are wanting people to do more for us because we have the money to pay them to do it, okay? But is it getting harder with the inflation and the cost of everything going up to have as much done for us? Because we can't afford as much, okay? Depending on if your income has gone up. So this would be on the production side, that's more the supply side. The GDP, as we first talked about it, is more on the demand side, okay? Here's a graph again that shows that production or supply side. Here's the services, the largest part. And, okay, and then we can see the line graph here that shows the different parts and how they've changed over time since 1950, okay? Services didn't used to be such a big part. Are you with me, KG?
Yeah.
Good? Okay, services only used to be about 37%, and so they were closer together in their proportions, and then the services, you can just see have taken off, especially since about the mid-80s again, okay? That was kind of a key time. Okay, so we can also look at the national income approach, and that's more of a minor way. The problem of double counting. So where in the production process do we count what is produced? Or consumed, produced, let's just focus on. Do we count it in the middle? Or do we count it at the very end? Yeah. Yeah, at the very end, because I think I still have it written up here. Yes, because if we look at this, the supply chain, we would have, like if it's a good, that we're producing a product, we'd have the manufacturer, they would sell it to a wholesaler. This is for larger industries. Wholesalers, who are the middlemen, they may sell it to distributors, like for grocery stores and that. We used to have like Best Yet or that. Somebody had to manufacture the food, then there were wholesalers that sold it out, then we had distributors, then it gets to the retailers, and finally, it gets to the end user, that consumer, the purchaser. That's where we count for GDP. Otherwise, if we counted here, and we counted here, and we counted here, and again here, we would be double counting, triple counting, whatever it might be, okay? So there's a certain point at which we count, and that's at the end. The terminal consumer. Okay, so that was at the bottom of 148. You can see there's a chart at the top, okay, for that shows the different areas of GDP. And then other ways to measure the economy, just be aware of these, like with the net national product, gross national income. Gross national product is close to the gross domestic product. It's just different in where the product is produced, okay? Because we may, like in the United States, companies may have plants in other countries, right? So you have to figure out, do we count what's produced in another country in our GDP, or do we not? So the GNP, excuse me, GDP includes only what the country produces within its borders, okay? GNP adds what domestic businesses and labor abroad produces, okay? And subtracts any payments that foreign labor and businesses located in the United States send home to other countries, okay? So the gross domestic product, domestic, it's what's made domestically within our country. Gross national product includes what's produced by our United States companies in another country. Okay, does that make sense? Gross national product. So the GDP is what cues you off. So calculating the GDP, it takes you through on page 147 of the Work It Out, those Work It Outs are really good. To calculate GDP, it shows you we just plug it in, then we can look at our net exports, whether it's a trade surplus, a trade deficit. We can also calculate the NNP, okay, and it's just a little bit different there. Okay, so then, if we are looking at GDP in just dollar value, is it going to be accurate? Why? Because of the overall rise in prices, right? Because of inflation. Because with inflation, prices are going up. Does that actually indicate that we're producing more?
No.
Not really, right? Because the prices are just going up. So we can't just compare dollars from 1950 to dollars in current, right? We've got to adjust it and bring it down into real GDP. We have to use a GDP deflator and bring it back down so that we can compare like apples to apples in the same dollar value, the purchasing power of the dollar, compared to apples to oranges, like $1950, the purchasing power compared to the purchasing power in 2024. So you can read through some of that with your GDP deflator and that. The concept is basically the most important, but there are some there's some information here on how to figure it, and then of course, I'll work it out, it's on page 150 to 151 about computing that. We're not gonna get real deep into that, I just want you to know the concept more, but it will be an open book test, so you'll be okay with that. There's some charts here, nominal and real GDP, you can see the changes over time. You can see that in 2012, they crossed. Okay, so that would indicate, the two lines crossed in 2012 because they were about the same there as we are figuring it. Okay, and then we can look at GDP over time, and you can see that graph. So as we look at that chart at the bottom of page 153, you can see like in 1930, did the GDP go down in the early 30s there? Page 153. What were we experiencing in the 30s? The Great Depression, yeah. So then we can, and I've kind of circled it here, when we got into the mid-40s, what had just happened? 1941 to 1945.
Is that what war?
Yeah, World War II, right? So it hurt us for a while because everything was going into our military, okay? Some plants shut down so that their employees could go work in the defense manufacturing, which my grandpa actually did that because they were trying to build equipment. So then after the war, a lot of times we will see an increase in our productivity as a country, and then we hit the early 80s. We had a tough time economically in the early 80s. Then we can see as we go along, then again about 2007. What happened in 2007? 2008 to 2014? We had the Great Recession, yes. And we had that collapse of the housing market, which took everything down. A lot of people lost their homes because they had been loaned money way beyond what they should have been able to pay, basically, and so everything started collapsing. And then again in 2020, what happened? COVID. Everything was shut down in March of 2020. So you can see different events in our economy by looking at our GDP over time, okay? So if you look on the board, and I talked about unemployment with this, but it also deals with like our GDP and our economy as a whole. We have this cyclical pattern, and so we have peaks when our economy is booming. T, you with me? T? Good? So we have peaks when we are booming. Things are going really good, and then we start going downhill. We have troughs, which would be a recession, and then we go up and down over history, okay? And so right now, before COVID, we basically were headed upwards. We were recovering from 2007 to 2014 where we were down here in a trough. We were headed up. And then it was artificially, when they shut everything down, boom, it took us down. So now we're trying to climb back up out of that hole, basically. Okay. So we can also look at comparisons of GDP between countries. Okay, so is everybody's GDP the same?
No.
No, such a big difference. It just depends where every country is at. Sometimes Europe will be having a boom while the United States is experiencing kind of a not sure uncertainty, or it could be the opposite. Different countries have different levels of GDP, and so that affects our exchange rate there. I'm on page 155 to 156. So we talk about measuring GDP per capita, because that brings it all into a comparison aspect. So we can look at the GDP divided by the population for that country and get a GDP per capita, because it is more comparable. Again, apples to apples instead of apples to oranges, because of size of country, things like that. GDP per capita. And how well does GDP measure the well-being of society? Is the GDP an end-all, tell-all? It totally shows the condition of a country? Nope. Basically, it's got some limitations as far as showing standard of living. We need to look at how well people are able to meet their basic needs, as well as do they have any disposable income and things like that. So there's a good paragraph there on page 159. It's the first full paragraph. While GDP includes what a country spends on environmental protection, healthcare, and education, it does not include the actual levels of environmental cleanliness, health, and learning. So there's other things that are not really measured that do impact people's standard of living. Okay. Does a rise in GDP overstate or understate the rise in the standard of living? Well, it just kind of depends. You've got to look at your data. And so we can tell a lot here. There at the Bring It Home, the last page, 160 of chapter 6, the bringing it home. We've really got to change GDP into the real numbers. So we're not just looking at the actual dollar amounts, we're bringing it into the actual numbers. We need to look at the level of standard of living. We need to look at a lot of different things that go into GDP and how it's measured. So that's chapter 6. Okay. Alrighty, we'll get started on chapter 7 here in just a little bit. Okay.